Welcome, friends. So welcome to another in our series of um, forums that ARE, its members of ARE themselves um, facilitate, often when we have topics that weren't, had to get canceled at the last minute. So this forum will be about a topic that I've not always been very interested in. And I think most friends here will maybe reflect some of my experience. I was brought up in a household that paid a lot of attention to the Bible. But I have to admit that the letters of Paul were something I found confusing, maybe boring, and sometimes even a bit repellent, depending on, what I was reading. Over the years, I've gotten interested, a little more interested, just because of, you get older and you look at things and, oh, that's interesting. Why did that happen? And also because, and I'll share the link with you, as Julian very kindly shared with me a link from Stuart Marshall, a British Quaker who, or Masters, I guess, who points out that the early Quakers, when they do quote scripture, about 70% of the time they're quoting Paul. So that's kind of interesting. And then pointing out that if we look at some selective passages of Paul, there's some very interesting things in there. So what I'm going to do this morning is not necessarily, but of course, all of you, when you want to chime in, please feel free to do so. But I'm not necessarily going to talk about the theology of Paul too much, other than as it impacts who Paul was as a literary and historical figure. So this isn't about the good or the bad stuff Paul wrote. I will start talking a little bit about that. It's more about getting to a point where I think I've come to, which is, first of all, who says we have to take every bit of scripture that's in there in some sort of way that we have to take it as an authority? I don't think anyone here does that anyway, but we also don't have to look at even things written in a single book of the Bible as representing a certain point of view. I guess what I'm doing is I'm saying we have permission to pick out whatever speaks to our condition and not pay attention so much to what doesn't. And I think that's the place I have gotten to with writings like those of Paul. We can all talk, we're all familiar with the misogyny in some of the passages, the homophobia in some of the passages, the apparent advice to just suck it up and go along with whatever oppression that we're suffering. Our oppressors have to be obeyed. All of those things certainly can be found in passages in the writing of Paul. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of give us permission to ignore those things and take the things that we like. And there are things like that. I think the first thing I'd like to do is, maybe share the screen and talk about some things that were going on with early Quakers. Let's see here if I can get, let's see, yeah. And See if this will really share this part of the screen. Okay. Well, not the right part of the screen, but let me get there. Okay. So here's from Romans 2. Okay. And I don't know if someone would care to maybe read that passage, Romans 2, verses 28 and 29. Anyone want to just unmute themselves? Just jump in and read it.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor a circumcision. Oh, it's cut off.
Oh, excuse me. Let me. Okay, maybe this won't work as well. Can I not move it? I'm sorry. We're experiencing some difficulties with getting the screen looking right here. That's probably just going to make it worse. Does that work better? If I do it.
One more small.
Okay, it's a little small, but are you able to read the whole thing that way?
Yeah, that.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
Some of it's still cut off, but it goes to nor is circumcision merely outward and physical, and then at 29 it cuts off.
Okay.
You
Nor
can-
is a, yeah, and then I think it's just, yeah.
You have your images covering it up. You need to.
There you go. Okay, there we go. Now let's try that.
There we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God.
Okay. And then there's that very famous passage right below it from Margaret Fell, where she, the passage where she quotes George Fox as saying, Christ says this and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say? With just a little bit more context, going back a few more sentences on that quote from Margaret Fell. Would someone care to read that? That's the small print down there below Romans 2.
It's not clear enough to read it.
Okay, it's too small. Let me see if I can make it. Let me see. I can make it a little bigger.
Unfocused.
Yeah. Okay.
But if you can fix it, I'll read.
Okay. Is that? Let's see here. Let's get that a little bigger. Is that a little bigger for you?
That's much better. Yeah.
Okay. I may have to do it in two screenfuls, but go ahead from the ellipsis there, and then I'll go down when you get.
Okay. And when they had done singing, he stood up upon his seat or form and descended that he might have liberty to speak. And he that was in the pulpit said he might. And the first words that he spoke were as followeth. He is not a Jew that is one outward, neither is that circumcision which is outward, but he is a Jew that is one inward, and that is circumcision which is of the heart. And so he went on and said, how that Christ was the light of the world, and lighteth every man that cometh into the world, and that by this light they might be gathered to God, etc. And I stood up in my pew, and I wondered at this doctrine, for I had never heard such before. And then he went on and opened the scriptures and said the scriptures were the prophets' words and Christ's and the apostles' words, and what as they spoke, they enjoyed and possessed and had it from the Lord, and said, then what had any to do with the scriptures? But as they came to the Spirit that gave them forth, you will say, Christ saith this, and the apostles say this. Okay, something moved. Okay, got it. But what thou canst thou say? Art thou a child of light, and hast walked in the light, and what thou speakest is inwardly from God?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. So you'll notice in that famous incident, he's quoting almost directly those words of Paul. And what's interesting is, of course, that Paul there is writing to a community of Christians in Rome, supposedly, who are many of them Jewish. So a statement like that makes a lot of sense for him to say that. George Fox is probably not talking to a lot of Jews there. You know, he's in Ulverston, in the Anglican Church there. So that's kind of interesting. And the idea that George Fox has walked into a church and has asked permission to speak and is speaking, okay, is also kind of interesting. Let's look at maybe the context for what a little bit more of the context for what Paul was saying here. Okay, it didn't go to the right place. I may have to just read this to all of you if I can't get the right screen up here. Let's see. All right. Yeah, I'll stop the sharing. Because of course what Paul was doing, as we read in the book of Acts, he was going around to lots of different synagogues all over the place, and he was asking for permission to speak and then standing up and speaking. Very similar to what George Fox was doing in a lot of churches all over the north of England and other places as well. So, I was going to ask somebody to read this and show this on the screen, but I'll just read this to you. I'm having trying to figure out how to get the right screen up at the right time. So I'm going to read from Acts 17, the first few verses. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you as a Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Okay, so Paul and George Fox are kind of doing the same thing. One of the things that we'll come back to is that Paul's audience, this hasn't been noted a lot, but just listen to how he describes the people who heard him, and some of whom were convinced. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. In other words, people who weren't Jews. And Paul was going to the synagogue. So that's kind of interesting. And we'll come back to this later. There are 2 writers that I've been paying a lot of attention to lately on this question of who Paul was and what he was doing. One named Robert M. Price also has a podcast called The Bible Geek, and another one named that some of you are more familiar with called John Dominic Crossan, who's written quite a few interesting works about early Christianity. And I know I've heard a number of us, of all of you talk about him. So, but Crossan points out that we don't typically pay attention. We pay attention to the fact that he was in the synagogue, and sometimes he caused an uproar and the people got mad at him. But what we don't pay attention too much is they always seem to point, oh, and there were some God-fearing people there, some God-fearing Greeks and some prominent women. So in other words, we've got to imagine, and now they have some archaeological evidence that this was happening. We've got to imagine that there were apparently a lot of just regular Roman Empire people, Greeks and others, who were quite attracted to Judaism and had started hanging around in the synagogues and were kind of supportive of Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, even though they hadn't converted. So this passage from Paul about you're a Jew, you don't have to get circumcised to be a Jew. That'd be a showstopper for a lot of people, getting circumcised. So Paul is saying you don't have to be circumcised to be a Jew. You can it's in your heart, and so this might have caused consternation among some of the more conservative traditionalist people there. So you can see how some of this controversy was happening around Paul. It's hard to just after the passage I read, people get very into a big uproar about this. There are problems caused for Paul and his companions, and they have to leave town. They go to the next town and do the same thing, and there's another uproar, so they have to leave town again, and so on and so on. And but always the mention of those God-fearing other people who aren't Jews but who are in the synagogue, and Crossan starts paying attention to that and saying, "Wow, what's going on here?" And then from another point of view, Robert M. Price, and I should just point out, John Dominic Crossan is Catholic, but has a very broad view of things, and one of Crossan's kind of main thing that he talks about in a lot of his books is how early Christianity, whether he's talking about the very first followers of Jesus or people like Paul, had an anti-imperialist program. They were pushing back against the oppressors, and he talks about how if someone like Paul walking into a town and saying Jesus is Lord, that wouldn't have just been, well, I've got my Lord, that's fine. You can have your Lord. No, that would have been seen as a direct challenge to the Roman authorities, because of course Caesar is Lord, and Caesar is the Son of God, by the way. That's how they mention that. So Crossan is always talking about that. But if you look at and Robert M. Price, who is a very learned man, has written many books about various aspects of the Bible, and is also describes himself. He's basically a defrocked fundamentalist pastor. He describes himself now as a Christian atheist, by the way. But Crossan, but Price is also a very he's a very gracious man who helps here. I've got a helper here. Okay.
A baby.
Yeah, there's a baby on that picture. Thank you. Thank you.
Baby.
Yes. Okay.
Why did her put her hands on her dad?
Oh, that is, yeah. I think she's looking at Liz's picture there. Yeah, Liz was a little baby once.
Come on over.
Okay, we're getting some domestic things arranged here.
You want to talk to the
Okay.
people?
All right. So anyway.
No, these are people.
Oh, these are people you can talk to. That's true. Yeah, they are. But Robert M. Price is very gracious scholar.
Let me go.
And whether the focus.
No, I get it.
Okay. Whether the focus of the other scholar is from a fundamentalist perspective, if they have something interesting to say, Price is right there. But Price points out that if you read Paul's own account of what he's doing in say Galatians. By the way, the convincing thing was to go get some chocolate. I think they're going to go raid the hoard of chocolate in the other room. But in Galatians, Paul talks very directly about his experience with the rest of the church. And once again, I'm going to try to share the screen here and see how far I can get. Okay, maybe I will. Okay, and then I'll get in here. I will go down to Galatians, where Paul talks about himself a little bit and about his relationship with the rest of the church. Okay. Can folks see that one okay? Yes? Anyone, just let me know if you can see my my screen okay?
Yes, we're seeing it fine.
Okay, fine. Can someone just read those first two verses?
I'll do it.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, an apostle, sent not from men, nor by a man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers and sisters with me, to the churches in Galatia.
Okay, thank you. And we'll see that this becomes important. This greeting, which is kind of standard on all of Paul's letters, people usually skip over that because it's just kind of, okay, you know, it's kind of like saying, dear so-and-so, how are you? The weather's good. Now let's get into, you know, the important stuff. But we'll see that this thing where he says, I am an apostle, not sent from men nor by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, gets important. And he kind of reemphasizes that. Steve, would you like to go on with verses 11 and 12?
I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, rather. I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ.
Okay, so personal authority. And then I'm just going to go on with chapter 2 there. We obviously left some ellipses in there. 2 verses 1 and 2. After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, that he means Peter, James, and John. I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. They recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, meaning Peter, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, and they recognized the grace given to me. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. Okay, so they're basically saying that he's divvied up with the other leaders of the church who they're going to be preaching to. That some of the rest of the church is going to be mostly dealing with Jewish Christians, and he's going to be dealing with Gentile Christians, okay, non-Jewish Christians. But and what we see is him going into the synagogue. So people have sometimes said, why was he going to the synagogues when he said he was preaching to the Gentiles? Well, maybe he was going into the synagogues to preach to those, you know, God-fearing non-Jewish people who were in the synagogues. Because if you look at a lot of his letters, he goes way, way into the weeds on Hebrew scriptures, on the Torah, on, you know, who Abraham and Moses were and things. Would the average non-Jew have understood any of that back in the day? Well, they would have understood that if they'd been hanging around with Jews in synagogues. So that's Crossend's assertion, is that what Paul was really doing was he was going around from synagogue to synagogue, preaching mostly to the non-Jewish people who were showing up in the synagogues as the most likely people that he could reach. And in fact, Crossan calls it convert poaching. In other words, he was going and you could see how maybe the Jewish people in the synagogue were getting upset with him, about what was going on, because also one of the things these non-Jewish people who were very sympathetic to and maybe even receptive to Judaism were doing was they were providing a protective buffer, between the Jewish community and the rest of society. In fact, he talks about prominent women, and there are a few archaeological sites that Crossan refers to where they have inscribed who helped, the donors that helped build this synagogue, and about 40% of them were not Jewish, and several of them are people like they're named as prominent members of the town council or things like that. So you could see how the local Jewish community would get kind of stirred up that here's this guy coming along trying to grab our friends and carry them off. So that's that. So far, what I've said is all about the way Paul is presented to us and the way he presents himself in his letters. Okay. Now I'm going to go a little bit, maybe out on a limb or over the edge, and I'm going to go with Robert M. Price. Okay. So Robert M. Price is a fairly he's a very well-known scholar, and he's very respected, but he loves him some controversy and some interesting different kinds of theories about things. So Robert M. Price reminds us that over the last 300 years, scholars have backed away from, and it's been about a 200 or 300 year process, started backing away from the literal authenticity of a lot of the writings in the Bible as they are presented to us. One of the first casualties, actually even from ancient times, the letter to the Hebrews, which was traditionally attributed to Paul. Even in ancient times, people were kind of not sure that Paul had written it, but they said, well, we'll accept it because if you add it to all of Paul's other letters, it makes 14, and that's 2 times 7, and 7 is a special number. So they said, okay, we'll accept the letter to the Hebrews kind of provisionally. Then starting about 1800, scholars start, so this is already over 200 years ago, scholars start chipping away at the authenticity of some of the letters of Paul. So, and by the time you get up into the 20th century, late 20th century, there is a question about whether any of the letters were written completely by a historical person called Paul. Okay. And what was happening instead was that for instance, if you go in and you read some of the passages from Paul, and I'm going to try to, once more, I'm going to attempt to share screen because I think you'll get what I'm talking about, especially those of you who've read some of his letters. Sometimes you think you're reading it's a seesaw, like he'll say, well, this, but no, how about this? And that's especially when he talks about Jewish law. Okay. He talks about Jewish law when, he'll say things like, you know what, you don't have to obey the Torah anymore to be saved. You don't have to follow these things. I do, but and a lot of people I know do, but you don't have to. You don't really have to. In fact, sometimes he says the law is sin and the law brings death. I mean, pretty strong stuff. And then in the next verse he'll say, oh, but don't think the law isn't valuable. It's important. And then, and then he'll say, because it, and then he'll talk about how it is important. And he kind of, and he never quite explains what the difference is, at least to my mind. He kind of just seesaws back and forth a lot of times. And so what a number of scholars, Robert M. Price and others, detect in this is that we have various hands writing this, and the usually so someone's written something and then someone says, well, no, but how about this? And so what we have gotten now is an amalgam, or a pastiche of different ways of talking about salvation, about how the church should be, and so forth, because it wasn't really written by one person. And the tendencies that we see in there are ones, people talk about Gnosticism, and a lot of you have, over the course of, talking about things like this, have heard of or talked of Gnosticism. Gnosticism being a kind of an interreligious movement that started in the first century, before or at the time of Jesus. And the idea behind Gnosticism was that there was this supreme being that was pure spirit and light, and this supreme being had several emanations, and some of these emanations had gotten more and more material, and so that there was another being, an inferior being called that had actually created this physical world. And because that being was inferior, this physical world had some problems with it. It had death, and it had sin, and it had other things in it. And so what a person should do is seek for inner enlightenment. And in later versions of Gnosticism, this gets to be more like esoteric knowledge, like secret handshakes and things you have to know. But the original version of Gnosticism was that it was just about having, being enlightened, so you could be reunited with the supreme being, with the being of light. And there was a man of light who was around, who the more gross, lower god had fought against. And so what you get when Christian Gnosticism becomes this idea that in the more radical versions of it, becomes the idea that there are two gods, and the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was that creator, who was vengeful and wrathful, and had brought sin into the world, and in fact those Christians would have said that the Hebrew Scriptures were in fact harmful. So there's one of the first popularizers of Paul. He's named Marcion, and Marcion is perhaps the person from whom we get a lot of the letters of Paul, and Marcion is possibly even the person who wrote some of Paul's letters himself. Marcion did not think that the Hebrew Scriptures had any value at all. And he only wanted there to be this inner revelation that comes from Christ, and that is based on individual experience, which a lot of Paul's writings do sound like that too. But if you think about it, if there's an emerging kind of church structure, a hierarchy and stuff, they're going to want to be able to have discipline, and they're going to want to be able to maybe even, like I said, enforce a certain hierarchy. they don't want someone going around saying it's all based on this inner revelation that I have. Okay. They're going to want to say, no, there are certain rules and regulations we have to follow. That revelation is not necessarily ongoing, that it all happened with Jesus and the 12 apostles. So therefore, what we have to do is we have to incorporate the Hebrew scriptures into our canon as well, as a way of kind of giving some sort of continuity and some sort of authority to things. So that's normally scholars call that the Catholicizing or the Orthodox view. So you can see both those hands at work in the letters of Paul. And the other question that a bunch of other questions come up, like for instance, we don't really hear about Paul's letters until maybe 50 or 60 years after his death. What was going on? Was someone cooking these things up? And this isn't to say that we're not talking necessarily about fraud. Think about it in modern terms. Think about I don't know, in a secular context where maybe some patriotic American decides he's going to write, a series of fictitious letters from George Washington to people living in the 21st century, and saying, hey, I see this going on and this going on. And in some of the letters of Paul, it does appear that he has that the writer, Paul, in quotes perhaps, is talking about long church traditions already, which wouldn't have been the case when Paul was writing. Paul probably died in around the year 64. Okay. The writer seems to be aware of things like the Jewish rebellion, which didn't start until a couple of years after Paul died, and then the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So there's kind of a tension there within the writings of Paul about that, and this is not to try to save Paul's reputation, but a lot of what we see as perhaps some of the more reactionary statements that Paul makes and things are probably interpolations from later Orthodox or Catholicizing writers. It's really hard to tell at this point what happened, but scholars will look at things like the language. They will look at things like references to events that Paul couldn't possibly have known about. They will, and then they will also look at something else that Paul was doing. So remember, when I point that those first two verses from Galatians, where Paul says, "Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, not from man." Well, Paul apparently, and you can suss this out from his writings and from Acts. There was apparently a little bit of an issue between the 12 apostles, the original followers of Jesus, and Paul, because Paul, you weren't there. You don't know what Jesus said. And Paul's saying, and an apostle is someone sent out by Jesus. That's what apostle means, sent out, right? So how possibly could you be an apostle or know what Jesus was saying? And Paul said, Jesus came to me directly. Okay, well, the problem is if Jesus came to him directly, then he could come to other people directly too. Once again, this is something that has to be tamed. By the time, the people, the canon of the New Testament is, formalized in the 300s, Paul is too well known. They can't just throw him out. Okay. So they have to sanitize him. They have to, do some things that kind of corral him. So the last three letters attributed to him, known as the pastorals, that is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are all about church government. How do you run a church? And who are the elders and that sort of thing. So So we have that kind of tension going on. And I don't know if does this remind anybody of what was going on with early Quakers and how they were relating to some of the some of the people around them or within themselves. It does to me. I'd be curious what some of you have to say about that. I can hear Emberly in the next room. She's singing, by the way. Yeah, Julian.
One of the concepts that you've talked about in terms of primitive Christianity is circumcision. And I think we all tend to understand that perhaps outside the Quaker experience as an outward concept, particularly in the Jewish faith. And the early Quakers, as I've come to understand them, for them, circumcision is an inward concept. And it has more to do with stripping away the things we do and say and how we are in the world that keep us from being in a closer relationship with the light. And the transition from the outward way of viewing that and the inward is something I haven't really understood yet, how that actually happened, whether it was sort of a Quakers emphasized the inward or the inner light, the inner guide, so forth. And therefore circumcision was part of that, or whether there was sort of a process of moving toward viewing circumcision in those inward terms.
Mm-hmm. And then we have that passage from Romans that we read right at the beginning that Hannah read for us, and that George Fox quoted pretty much verbatim in his famous talk in the church in Ulverston. I'm interested in. Oh yeah, go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
It seems to me that the conflict that Paul versus the original Jesus Jews, as I like to call them, is similar to early Quakers in the sense that the authority Paul claims directly from the Spirit versus the authority from personal experience or scripture, if you will. Certainly the Jesus Jews did not reject the Old Testament. That could be somewhat similar to early Quakers in the sense of conflict between what they may have been hearing from George Fox or other authorities versus their inner light in terms of organizing and establishing Quaker practices.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to paste a few things in the chat here. And please feel free to comment. I'm going to paste a few things in the chat here that basically have to do with some of the scholarship on Paul, and also what Julian had shared with me from before, which is a very, like I said, a very nice little essay with some references by a British Quaker who talks about some of the things early Quakers were using. So let me just.
I posted that link, Howard.
Oh, you did? Oh, thank you so much. Great. And there we go. That's great. I'll also post some things to some things from where Crossan and Price explain some of their views and some of their scholarship. Let me just see if I can get that all in here. Yeah, I'll pop that in, see if that goes. All right, did that paste? No, it didn't. Okay, I might have pasted twice there. Yeah, it did paste twice. So John Dominic Crossan, 2 YouTube videos, one, the shorter version, about 5 or 10 minutes, and the other one, a longer hour version. Same thing with Robert M. Price, a shorter and a longer version of his view about Paul, where his writings came from, and who was fighting who over what in these writings. And I think that's an important context to have. I think we're right at 10:50 here. Things really flew. I guess that's because I was talking. So they flew for me. Does anyone have something to add at the end, or maybe to put a bow on this?
Howard, I'm not seeing the links you said you posted.
Okay. Okay. Did I maybe not post them to everyone? No, I did. Are other people having problems seeing them? They are having problems seeing them? Okay. Okay.
I can't see them either.
Maybe I didn't hit enter.
Howard, when you post, if you post them before everybody gets on, they won't see them.
I just posted them. So
Okay.
maybe I just didn't hit enter. Oh, there we go. I didn't hit enter.
Okay.
Okay. And they're in there twice. So those are some fun, I call them fun, maybe not everyone would, but there's some fun YouTube.
Howard,
Yes.
have you read Paul Anderson on Paul?
No, I haven't.
He's a Quaker theologian at
That's
George
right.
Fox College.
References, yeah.
Just something, I don't know, has anybody read him? It's been a long time since I did any reading.
The link that Julian posted does make reference to Paul Anderson,
Okay.
but he might be someone you could find bits from online as well. Well, I guess it's time for us to go into worship. So thanks, friends, for bearing with me as I sort of spilled my what there is in my head about this, and hope it can be fruitful or at least interesting to some of you. Thank you.